So I think a chat link for the AMA with Alex maybe entering into the thread. Let's just enjoy this applause for a second. And so I think that on the chat we will be seeing the link to the AMA. And in the meantime, here in the main hall, we're going to crack on. So thank you very much, Alex, and we will people can find you for the AMA in a bit. Next up, we have a very fascinating talk called Discovery and Invention When Designing with AI. And this talk is with Jess Holbrook from Google, and he's the founder and lead of Google's People and AI Research Group, acronym PAIR, who could focus on making AI partnerships productive, enjoyable, and fair. And so they do a rich range of things, human AI interaction research, and create open source tools and platforms to build AI responsibly and widen the circle of those who can participate in the development of this extraordinary set of technologies. Prior to Google, he was a UX researcher, and it's always good to begin one's career in that area because it builds a lot of empathy, both at Amazon and Microsoft. And on the subject of empathy, he got his PhD in psychology from the University of Oregon, and his undergraduate degree also in psychology, also in the Northwest from the University of Washington. So thank you so much, Jess, for joining us here. There's going to be an AMA after the talk in the AMA room. So you can begin thinking of your questions now. And with that, I will leave it to you, Jess. Thank you so much. You're on mute.
Unmute myself. All right. You can't start without somebody being on mute, right? All right. How are we sounding? Can you hear me? Sound all right?
Look a bell. Perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Let me get everything going here. All right. All right. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. My name is Jess Holbrook. I am the co-lead of the People plus AI research group at Google. And my talk today is really about a way of framing some of our work that we've come upon recently. And the argument I'm going to make to you is that AI has always been human-centered, whether we recognize it or not. Used to kind of talk about how can we make AI more human-centered, but our thinking on this has kind of pivoted in the last few weeks even. So let's just start off with, this group is probably familiar in some way with machine learning and AI. It's the ability to take currently lots of data, create and identify patterns to do predictions better than heuristic systems have been able to do historically. And we've really moved, especially in the past 8 years, but even in the last, frankly, 4 years, from things that worked in a research setting to things that worked in the real world. So we're all familiar with things like song and video recommendations, machine learning and AI. Also, I'm just going to use those terms interchangeably for this talk. Are being used to do really useful things like predict the change in price on flights in the future. They're being used to be able to suggest ways to respond to different fans and viewers on things like YouTube and helping creators to engage more with their audiences. Some of the ones I'm really excited about is they're actually being used for a lot of accessibility use cases. Here's an example of a computer vision model being able to recognize products and help somebody who might have impaired vision better navigate a grocery store. Also, everything running on the phone locally, not going to the cloud. We're also having really, really cool engagements like this. If you've never seen this, check out Kid Mob, where they do these superhero workshops where we're able to work with them to use AI to help kids with limb differences kind of create and express the superpowers that they know that they have. Of course, there's self-driving cars, and so we start to move to cases that are a bit lower stakes, like a song recommendation, to very high stakes situations, like cars, self-driving cars. And then also some work that I'm really excited about coming out of Google, which is around flood forecasting. So we're able to better and more accurately predict floods warn people when flooding might occur and quite literally save lives. So when we look at all these use cases, you know, AI and ML usually get painted as a very computer science field, very mathy, very inaccessible to people. And I really want to challenge that today. Because one of the things that becomes really obvious when you dig into it is that human judgments drive virtually every facet of AI. And I'm going to start to the rest of the talk to talk about some of these different judgments. So this is the extremely simplified model of how you know, an ML model development works. We have training data that are collected and labeled for a supervised learning set. Models are built, trained, and evaluated, and then predictions are generated in some sort. But really, and then this kind of feeds back in some systems, not in all. But really, the reality of it is we choose the data sources that are used, collected and labeled. We determine the evaluation metrics to decide when a model is accurate enough or has the right characteristics for deployment. And then we get affected by the results of these. And so all along the way, it's a very human and very user experience and frankly, a product approach to all these different spots. So this is one of the central insights that led to our group at Google, the People Plus AI Research Group. There's our website if you want to check it out. And so we really do three things. Building on this insight, you can't just address the need at one point of the development process. So we conduct and publish human AI interaction research to try to influence the academic field, which then influences industry. We create and launch open source tools and platforms to build AI responsibly. So we don't like to tell people what they should do, but not give them a way to do it. So we try to build tools. One of the examples there is at the bottom, our embedding projector that allows you to examine high dimensional data sets, high dimensional embedding spaces. And then we widen the circle of who can participate in the development and application of AI. And we do this through events, but one of the really fun ones there is at the top is a thing called Teachable Machine. If you've never checked it out, it's built on top of something called TensorFlow.js that our team built, and then our brilliant friends over at the Creative Lab, you can see Baron Webster there, that demonstrated this. And it's a way to train an AI model in your browser using your webcam, and you can do it in like a minute. It's really cool. Teachable Machine if you want to go check it out. And one of the ways that we try to bring this all together and focus people and help them understand how human-centered AI is something that we produced a little over a year ago called the People Plus AI Guidebook. There's the link there. And what it is it's a guide written to help UXers and product people follow a human-centered approach to AI throughout the entire development process. If you're familiar with human-centered design, about 30% of the guidebook will seem really obvious to you, and that's very intentional. It's supposed to be hooked on that process. And so what I want to do for the rest of the talk is actually walk you through a few of the different insights in the guidebook as a way to show how focusing on people will improve literally the model itself, but also the product experience of using an AI or ML model. Sorry about that. It's the morning where I am, so still caffeinating up. This guidebook has 6 chapters: user needs in defining success, data collection and evaluation, explainability and trust, errors and failing gracefully, mental models, and feedback and control. I'm going to try to really go very quickly through 3 examples from just 3 of the chapters today. Starting with the user needs in defining success. One of the big ways we're trying to move people is from a world where essentially people only think of, can we use AI to blank, to something more like, how might we solve blank, and can AI solve this problem in a unique way? Of course, like any new kind of breakthrough or any new technology, it's funny to call AI new, but maybe deep learning new, or not even deep learning, but the deep learning revolution kind of starting at 2012 and beyond, has had everyone just rushing to try to apply it to every single thing. And really we're missing the point that AI and ML are not appropriate for every opportunity, every problem. And so you might actually be able to solve it with a basic heuristic system or something else. And so we're really looking for where AI and ML can add unique value. We have some heuristics in the guidebook around when AI is probably a better fit and probably not. Of course, there's no hard and fast rules. And of course, this is an evolving space. AI is probably going to be better if you're doing something around personalization or, say, prediction of future events that are well predicted based on historical ones. That's a very important caveat. And then basic stuff like natural language understanding. AI is probably not better when you need situations with high predictability. So you don't want personalization, you don't want things changing. There are costly errors. You require complete transparency. And then my personal favorite is when people tell you they don't want it. So there has been a rise in people saying, yeah, we do not want, machine learning, AI, or more generally an algorithm to do this thing. And I'm a big proponent of listening to people and doing what they request. So those are cases where AI can be a better fit, but sometimes it's not. This is an example of that. I'm actually going to kind of skip through this of looking at how personalization can be bad, because what personalization does is it prevents habituation. Here's an example of habituation. And there's this example from one of our articles where you might have a tap target where somebody's looking to find something, but if there's a re-ranking algorithm based on personalization, all of a sudden it's moved everything, and the built up habituation is now lost, and you're going to require more cognitive effort. One of the best ways to do this is probably not a hard sell on this audience, but is to prototype. So with AI and ML especially, you can kind of go from these lo-fi to hi-fi prototypes. We are big fans of Wizard of Ozing prototypes. We do a lot of that on our team. And then also we try to work with these models that are kind of using like a functional subset, or kind of a janky model that essentially hasn't been really strongly tuned, but does good enough to get feedback on the product. All right, next I'm going to talk about something from data collection and evaluation. So this is something that a lot of UXers and even product people don't really think about. Like they say the word data set and it's just a black box, or like, oh yeah, it's a monolithic thing. But I actually really want more UXers and product people to get into data collection and understand the data that are fueling ML and AI models. The training data, how it's sourced, and how those data are labeled directly determines the AI system output and UX quality. And a UXer and a product person's job is to align user needs with those data needs. One of the challenges that can come in with data is bias or fairness issues, and I'm sure this audience has like at least kind of heard that somewhere in the last year. So I want to kind of go through a quick. Oh, sorry, I'm just looking at a little text message I got. Okay, no, never mind. I want to go through a little exercise with people. So usually when we're in a big group, I ask the audience to do this. So everyone, please just take a moment and imagine a shoe. Okay. How many of you imagined something like this? I'm imagining some hands going up. A sneaker, a casual shoe. Okay, some hands went up. How many of you imagined something like this? A business shoe, a loafer, something along those lines. Okay, some other hands go up. And how many of you imagined this? A high heel, usually formal, usually worn by women. So what you're seeing here is typically what we see is the vast majority of people in the audience raise their hand on the sneaker. And of course, the vast majority of people who raise their hand for the high heel are women. And so what we see here is an inherent bias that nobody was really thinking about around shoes, around a very basic thing. And this isn't a hypothetical. This actually came up in an experiment we ran. So there was this really fun experiment, again, with our friends at the Creative Lab, called Quick Draw. And what it did is you went to a website and you tried to draw something, and an AI model tried to identify what it was. And what happened is everyone who initially went to it drew something like the sneaker. So the model started to identify that as what shoes look like. And so when somebody came and drew a high heel, it was like, I don't know what that is, or sorry, it's very difficult not to use anthropomorphic language when talking about AI and ML. The model could not properly identify that, or it dropped accuracy or couldn't understand it at all. So bias had crept into the model by no one's intention, but it was reflecting the inherent bias that the people interacting with it had. Another interesting example from that same experiment with Quick Draw was asking people to draw chairs. You can see some bias or tendency or trend or whatever you want to call it in just asking people to draw a chair. So these are from different countries, and you can see how there's variance. One of the ones that really stands out is this is a randomly selected 1,000 drawings from each of these. In Korea, you kind of see that the tilt of the chair versus, say, Russia, that's has a little bit of a tilt to. Brazil and the United States is pretty straight on. And then South Africa has a more variance in kind of like where the seat lies. So these appear all over the place. Another one was with Translate. So the Translate team was translating languages, and they're basing this on massive text data sets. But a lot of what was happening is some languages are gendered, And this wasn't taken into account for the models, and this is a few years ago. And so they were inherently translating some things with bias, like anytime you'd ask about doctors, it would say, he is a doctor. And so they made a change and intervened and said, okay, now we're actually going to split out when we have gender specific translation, so people have both. And so we can kind of almost break that chain of bias. So another thing you can do, so I gave you a couple examples there of thinking about bias and some product interventions. And so what can you do to help or create or afford, what can you do to help avoid creating or reinforcing unfair bias? One of the really interesting things is designing rater tasks. This is something most UXers aren't doing, and we should, because it matters a lot. Raters are the people who label data sets to train an algorithm. Here's an example of like one of the Google rating facilities. And so what they're able to do is kind of convert human intelligence, frankly, into model intelligence. And this is an example of saying, trying to identify different kinds of bread. Here's another example. I think the tasks are really fascinating. I know I'm a UX person, so of course I'm fascinated by the UX. This is trying to match information on different websites, and it's kind of this quite, this is old, but kind of quite brutal interface for them to try to work on. And then there's another one that's really fascinating to me where they were trying to identify hair types. And so you might look at this and some of you might say, oh yeah, that's really doing a good job capturing all the different kinds of hair types in the world. But I think if you look, you'll notice quite a few are missing. And so this is another way where bias can get into your model based on the way that you made your rater task. This is continues when you have things like select all images that show a cat. You'd think that would be a very simple task, right? Okay, there's a cat there, there's a dog there, but then is a popsicle cat drawing a cat? Is a statue, based on the cat-like deity a cat? Is a tiger a cat? All this really matters. And, we can move to something that's more important than, are you finding a cat? And that's how you're defining things like that show images that show a woman, which count here. And this matters a lot because it forces a conversation. One of the really interesting things about AI and ML is they force specificity in ways that we haven't had to before. And so that forces conversations that we haven't had to before. And I think that's the crux of a lot of what you're seeing. This is kind of an example of training, rating, adjudication is really interesting, as well as how do you design the process for two raters if they disagree if that's a cat or not to resolve that. And all these things can really, really improve the product. All right, last one I'm gonna do very quickly because I'm a little over time, but we're a little ahead on the schedule, so I'm gonna absorb a little bit of that time. I hope I don't offend anyone, is explainability and trust. If you think of a very simplified system of how much a user trusts your product or feature, or whatever it might be, from no trust to too much trust, what we want is calibrated trust. Calibrated trust is when the user knows what the system can do well, and they also know when they need to use their own intelligence to correct the system. That's where we want to land. This is one of our favorite graphics of this, or representations of this. You do not want the expectation of the amazing SpongeBob popsicle and then get the reality of the melty SpongeBob monster face that will haunt your nightmares. One of the other things to remember too is that models their confidence can vary a lot. Going back to the teachable machine example, this is Barron kind of showing one where he trained one model just on his face and one on this little cute kitty. I can't remember what the cat's name, what that name of that cat is. I'm sorry, Pusheen, something like that. But you can see slight movements that he's doing are totally changing the confidence of the model. And if that's how the model is going to react, we want to make sure that the user knows that and isn't going to be overconfident in the model. There's all different kinds of ways you can then explain the system. And one of the ways we think about this is user impact from low to high on the x-axis and confidence of the system from low to high on the y-axis. So you can say, let's just pick some diagonals here. So if you go to the, let's go to the bottom right corner, user impact is high, but confidence of the system is low. The user should always verify the system's decision, consider using explicit explanations, uncertainty displays, complete explanation. If we go to the other corner, upper left corner, so confidence of the system is high and user impact is low, user should trust the system's decision with minimal explanation. Consider using an implicit explanation or no explanation. One of my favorite examples here are spam filters. Almost every spam filter uses machine learning at this point, but it wouldn't really make sense for every time a spam filter filtered a message, it explained to you why it filtered a message, right? That would kind of defeat the purpose of the spam filter, so it can kind of do it silently. That was a whirlwind through 3 different examples from just 3 of the chapters in the guidebook. I really encourage everyone to check it out. There's 6 more chapters. Each one of them has like 3 to 4 of these kind of things. We really try to bias it for, I hope that you look at it and learn something new each time, not like, oh yeah, I've heard this, I've heard this. So just as a reminder, you know, this whole process involves human judgment and human intervention, and there's lots of humans involved about picking the problem that we're doing, humans involved in the data sets, the data themselves, the data collection process, the data labeling process, and then thinking about the users and calibrating their trust and caring for them and helping them not overtrust or undertrust the system. And this is why I argue that, you know, we think that AI is human-centered, whether we recognize it or not, and we haven't for too long. So let's start to recognize, honor, and act on that fact. Thanks a lot, everybody, and I'd love to start doing a little Q&A.
Thank you very much indeed, Jess. That's a remarkable talk. Yes, we can express our satisfaction and pleasure at all these interesting ideas with the feedback buttons for a bit of applause. So fire away, everyone. Good. And so, Jess, you're going to be doing an AMA in the AMA room along with Alex. Listen to all that applause. Everyone's really enjoyed that.
I'm frozen. sorry for the frozen image, everybody. Oh, there we go. I'm back.
That's all right. Yeah, so a lot of very stimulating stuff, and it's interesting to think of how AI is really sort of sedimented human cognition. You know, human cognition poured into these networks to work automatically. And you know, I don't want to steal for your actual AMA, which I think the link is going to go into the chat in a second. But do you find the word bias to be unsatisfactorily narrow when it comes to all the ways in which humans influence the structure of these artificial cognitive systems?
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's one very particular piece of the puzzle. So we talk a lot about, there's a lot of debate in the community around, you know, how to think about bias versus fairness versus justice versus equity versus, you know, I'm trying to think of another one there. My colleagues would be mad at me for this. What's that?
I'm saying imagination, maybe.
Yeah. I mean, there's lots of interesting ways we can think of this. You know, typically it has to do a lot more. One thing I'd love to actually talk about in the AMA is that a lot of AI and ML is trying to be decontextualized. So it's a model that kind of sits in a vacuum and doesn't interact with society. And this is kind of the research angle. But as soon as it engages with humans that live in society, it is then contextualized. And so something where you might say a model isn't working in one case can be extremely harmful to somebody that's making algorithmic decisions about prison sentences or who gets loans or something like that. And in another case, it can be inspirational. So you have an AI that's essentially generating, say, images for you as you're trying to do a creative act. If you've ever seen the Artists and Machine Intelligence group come out of Google, they kind of take AI to weird things and create really beautiful and brilliant art. And so I think it's a lot about the context that you then plug that technology into.
Mm-hmm. So great. I've got a couple more questions for you. Since we're ahead of time, just to whet people's appetite for the AMA, which will be kicking off at 5 p.m. And the first is just, you mentioned Wizard of Oz prototyping, and which got some good appreciation on the chat thread. But just in case people aren't familiar with it, would you like to talk a little bit about why that's so fun and valuable and what it is?
Yeah. So it's not a new technique by any means. I mean, we're probably coming up on 40-ish years of its use. But it's, you know, as I squint and look off into history. And so it's a way that when you don't have a working system, and it used to be with heuristic code, you essentially have a human pretend to be the system. And you figure out a way that the human can essentially generate the interface or the output. I think the easiest way to think of this is with chatbots. So when we went through the chatbot fever about like four years ago or whenever it was, when that was on fire, it's very simple to set up a system where when you don't have a working chatbot, you have somebody interacting with another person on the other end, acting like a chatbot. So this is also in the context of user research. Like you'd never do that in deployment or be deceptive or anything like that. That's not good. Please don't do that. But it's an easy way to kind of represent machine intelligence with human intelligence. We're actually pretty good at pretending to be a decently intelligent machine there.
Right, superb. And yeah, you gave a couple of pieces of advice to product managers, which I just want to flag, and maybe you can add a little bit more color. So one of them was to familiarize themselves with creating models, and also designing rater systems or protocols. And can you speak to how they can be combined in a normal product designer at a typical company's work practices and flow, and some of the advantages they might find from becoming skilled in those two things?
Yeah, I think that, I mean, one is a product manager's job is never endingly complex. And I'm always, I'm always wary of adding something to their list. So hopefully this is something that can replace and help them down the road. So one of the ways is to really get involved. One of the things that we do at Google is we have a training where, and I know this isn't possible for everybody, but we try to have a training where UX, PM, product management, and software engineers all go together to initially learn about machine learning and AI, and starting with just some basic things like a shared vocabulary. So we found that oftentimes teams just quite literally use the same word for different things. So there's this funny thing of like, okay, let's just have a shared vocabulary from the beginning. Okay, now you can start to get into the data practices and ask questions about where the data come from. Why do we think this is the right data? How are we designing those rater tasks? And this is almost always guided by one of the harder questions is that how do you define the success of your product? So if you can clearly define that, a lot of the other questions actually flow out quite nicely. But that's one of the hardest things to define for a lot of teams. And so then you can get into the fact of, are we using the right data sets? Are we collecting from a broad enough data sets that include all of our potential users? One of the other ways to think about bias is there's a moral case for bias and an ethical case for bias that is very important. There's also just a really strong business case to avoid bias, right? If you had a product that just quite literally doesn't work for the majority, let's say you have a product that uses computer vision and performs better for lighter skin tones than darker skin tones. You've quite literally just built a product that's not going to work that well for the majority of the humans on the planet. Like, that's just bad business. Like, that's just not a good business decision to make. So there's lots of examples like that where there's both an ethical and a very clear business case to avoid bias in your process. And I'm trying to think, I want to give you one more really explicit example in there. I think the rater tasks is a really interesting one. It sounds like a minute thing, but it's really interesting to get into that and to understand, do the raters understand your task, and are they giving you the labels in the way that you really will actually lead to a model that's has the performance that you need.
And I suppose with products like TikTok, one way of reading that product is that the whole thing is designed as a task for participants to maximize the quality of info on how engaging the videos are. Which might be another.
Yeah, from that angle, they're quite interesting because they're the first company. I mean, they were Musical.ly before, but what makes them so interesting is most of the companies that you think of today as big AI or ML companies were big data companies before, or they had something like a social network to bootstrap. And Musical.ly and TikTok had neither. So they're really fascinating because they're the first like algorithm first companies, because a lot of the other companies looked at and said, oh my gosh, look at all this data. We can basically jam this into a model and have a decent performance come out, where they were the first ones who kind of had to start from not having that. And so yeah, they're a fascinating company for a number of reasons, but that's one of them.
Yes, and sort of it then becomes the task of the product manager to design the interface in a way which can train the model in the quickest possible way. All right, well, we're about to wrap up here. We've just got a couple more comments in the chat. Matt LeMay, who is a coach and a consultant at Southern Compass, says, I remember that brief moment 6 years ago when every chatbot sounded like Poochie the rocking dog from The Simpsons.
Yes.
And, Ollie Joel, who's a senior product manager at Tesco. They've been great in the comments today. Good for Tesco. Um, said, enjoyed the talk, Jess. And we go just going back to facial recognition, and you kind of touched on this in your last response, but facial recognition today, there's been particularly controversial as of late, with bias referenced in its struggles. How could a human-centered approach ensure facial recognition is looked at in the right way? And how is it being looked
Yeah.
at?
Yeah, it's a very complex topic, and there's definitely people who know more than I do. I think some of the most interesting things to do there, if you're not familiar with some of the arguments, like Meredith Whitaker and AI Now have made very strong arguments here. Timnit Gebru and her colleagues have made very strong arguments here. And so that's one that I think is most interesting, in that it's a really interesting conversation because it started about, one is accuracy. So people basically said, oh, the problem's accuracy, and if we make it accurate, and no mistakes, then it'll be okay. But I think they've argued very well and very convincingly, and you see it in legislation changes, that no, even if you had a fully accurate system, that doesn't get rid of the problem. That doesn't get rid of the potential for abuse, for bias, for the, frankly, oppression of people. And so the human-centered approach there is really at the level of, do we want this at all? And the challenge there is human consensus, or human debate, or human, getting a group of humans to say, what do you want? And I think what's really interesting is this has led to legislative changes across the country where people have said, oh, now that we know about this issue, we don't want this. And they vote in a democratic way, or the representatives who are democratically elected say, you're right, we don't want this. And I think that I love that, because that's human-centeredness, frankly, outside of technology, right? It kind of didn't get into like the design of the thing, or like, oh, it's a usability problem or an accuracy problem. People said, no, we don't want this. And I love that. Like, that's how it's supposed to work, right? People are supposed to say, this is the kind of life we're trying to create. And that thing is not part of the life that we're trying to create. So I love that. And yeah, I really recommend going and checking out what they've written. They've written extremely well researched, extremely well done reporting on that.
And would you just repeat their names for everybody so people can make the Google search?
Yeah. I mean, and apologies if I leave anybody out, but the two that really stand out to me are Meredith Whitaker at AI Now. If you check out AI Now, they do a tremendous amount of brilliant research. I would also, and then Timnit Gebru, who's a researcher at Google. And then I would also put in Data and Society. Data and Society is a group that has written about this, and they do fantastic work as well.
Okay, well, thank you ever so much. And so Jess is going to be carrying on doing an AMA, and that's going to be in the AMA room. And I think the link will very likely find its way back into the chat. So thanks very much, Jess. Extremely informative and interesting. And so we're now going to take a break for about 35 minutes from this room. And in that period, we've got a number of excitements. So you can join Nora in the Peace Den for a bit of kind of meditation and mindfulness, could be quite nice. Or you can join Jess and